It's 1944. The skies over Germany are being shredded by Allied bombers day and night, wave after wave. The Luftwaffe is bleeding out. Their best pilots are dead. Their best planes can barely keep up. Germany is losing the air war, and everyone knows it. Then, out of nowhere, something streaks past an Allied formation at nearly 550 miles per hour. No propeller, no piston engine roar, just a shriek, like the sky itself tearing open. The Allied pilots freeze. Some think it's a rocket. Some think it's a missile. One pilot radios back. It came out of nowhere. Gone before we could even react. It wasn't a rocket. It wasn't a missile. It was a jet. The world's first operational combat jet aircraft. The Messerschmitt Me 262. And here's the insane part. If Hitler had unpersonally interfered with it, the entire war might have ended differently. Today, we're going back to one of the most fascinating and tragic stories in military history. A weapon so advanced, so terrifyingly ahead of its time, that the engineers who built it were already living in the future while the world was still fighting with machines of the past. Stick with me, because this isn't just a story about a plane. It's a story about ego, obsession, genius, and how one man's arrogance may have cost him everything. To understand just how radical the Me 262 was, you have to understand the world it was born into. In the late 1930s, every major air force on Earth was still thinking in propellers, piston engines, the kind of technology that hadn't changed fundamentally since the First World War. Faster, yes. More powerful, sure, but the same basic principle. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner of Germany, an engineer named Hans von Ohain was working on something that most people thought was science fiction, a jet engine. The idea was elegant in concept. Pull air in the front, compress it, ignite fuel, blast the exhaust out the back, and let pure thrust do all the work. No propeller, no crankshaft, just clean, screaming, continuous power. Messerschmitt got the contract. Their engineers got to work. And by 1942, the prototype Me 262 had its first fully jet-powered flight. It hit 520 miles per hour. To put that in context, the best Allied fighters at the time, the P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire, were doing around 440. The Me 262 didn't just beat them, it lapped them. Even the engineers testing it couldn't fully believe what they'd built. Test pilot Fritz Wendel landed after that first flight, and reportedly just sat in the cockpit for a long moment, shaking his head. They had created something the world had never seen before. A weapon from the next era, accidentally built in the middle of the last one. Now here's where history takes a maddening turn. By 1943, it was clear to almost everyone in Germany's military leadership that the Me 262 should be deployed immediately as an interceptor, a defensive weapon to tear apart Allied bombing raids. That was its natural role. It was fast enough to catch bombers. It was armed with 4 30mm cannons that could tear a B-17 in half. Every Air Force general wanted it in the sky yesterday. Hitler had other ideas, obsessed with the idea of going on offense, of striking fear into the Allies with a wonder weapon that could bomb cities. Hitler reportedly asked his engineers during a demonstration, "Can this aircraft carry bombs?" The engineers, knowing better than to say no to Hitler, said, "Technically, yes." That was the moment everything went sideways. Hitler ordered the Me 262 to be converted into a fast bomber, what he called the Blitz bomber. This made almost no operational sense. The aircraft wasn't designed for it. The modifications added weight, reduced speed, and completely undermined what made the plane special in the first place. Valuable months, possibly over a year, were lost, redesigning, retrofitting, and arguing through bureaucratic channels, while Allied bombers continued pounding German cities unmolested. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most decorated fighter aces, reportedly told Hitler directly that converting the Me 262 into a bomber was tactical madness. He was relieved of his command. The engineers, the generals, the pilots, they all saw what Hitler couldn't, or wouldn't. The greatest air weapon of the war was being strangled by the ego of the man who needed it most. By the time the Me 262 was cleared for combat use as a fighter interceptor in late 1944, the situation for Germany was already catastrophic. But even then, even fighting with one hand tied behind its back, the Me 262 was terrifying. Allied pilots who encountered it described the experience as surreal. You'd be flying formation at 25,000 feet, and suddenly something would blur through your formation so fast it barely registered. By the time your brain processed what you'd seen, it was already a mile gone. The Me 262 wasn't just faster, it operated in a completely different tactical dimension. It could dictate every engagement, choose when to attack, when to disengage, when to simply vanish. No Allied fighter could force it into a turning fight it didn't want. In the hands of pilots like Walter Nowotny, who scored kills flying it in its earliest combat deployments, it was devastating. A fully resourced fleet of Me 262s, deployed a year earlier as interceptors, could have made Allied daylight bombing campaigns prohibitively costly. Historians have estimated that even a force of just 300 operational jets, used correctly, could have changed the calculus of the air war completely. Instead, Germany managed to produce around 1,400 Me-262s total, but fewer than 300 ever saw actual combat. Hamstrung by fuel shortages, pilot losses, and infrastructure bombed to rubble, the plane that could have changed everything spent most of the war sitting in a factory, waiting for a decision that came too late. Let's put the Me-262's technology in real perspective, because it's easy to throw around the phrase ahead of its time without feeling what that actually means. The Me-262 flew in 1942. The first American jet fighter, the P-80 Shooting Star, didn't reach combat readiness until after the war ended. The British Meteor, which did see limited action, was slower and less capable. Jet aviation wouldn't become standard in air forces worldwide until the early to mid-1950s. The engineering concepts pioneered in the Me-262s. Junkers Jumo, 004, engine axial flow turbines, variable geometry nozzles, high-temperature alloy blades became the blueprint for every jet engine that followed. Engineers from the Me-262 program were actively recruited by both the United States and the Soviet Union after the war. Their knowledge helped build the first generation of Cold War jet fighters. The swept-wing design being explored for later variants of the Me-262 directly influenced the F-86 Sabre, the jet that defined air combat over Korea less than 5 years later. Germany had stumbled into the jet age while everyone else was still perfecting the propeller age, and they'd done it under wartime conditions, with limited resources, under constant bombardment. That's not just impressive, it's almost incomprehensible. There's a part of this story that doesn't get talked about enough, and I think it matters. The men who flew the Me-262 knew they were flying something extraordinary. Many of them were flying it in the last desperate weeks of a war already lost. They took off from bombed-out runways, with barely enough fuel, chased by Allied fighters the moment they tried to land. The jet engines of the era were notoriously unreliable. They could flame out without warning, and the plane handled very differently from anything pilots had trained on. The learning curve was steep and unforgiving, and yet they flew. Walter Nowotny was killed in November 1944 when his Me-262 was ambushed while returning from a mission, engines failing, unable to maneuver. He was 23 years old and had over 250 aerial victories. These were men flying the future, dying in the present, for a cause the rest of the world had already decided was over. I don't say that to romanticize the Nazi war machine. Let me be absolutely clear. This was a regime built on monstrous ideology and catastrophic human suffering. The weapons it built were used in service of that, but the engineers, the pilots, the mechanics who made the Me-262 fly, many of them were, at their core, people who loved aircraft and believed in what they were building. And they built something genuinely extraordinary in genuinely impossible circumstances. History doesn't always separate neatly into heroes and monsters. Sometimes it's more complicated than that. The Me-262 flew for less than a year in combat. It produced no strategic difference in the outcome of the war, but it changed everything that came after it. Every jet fighter that ever roared off a carrier deck, every commercial airliner that ever crossed an ocean, every scrambled interceptor that ever punched through the sound barrier, in some small but real way, they all trace a line back to a German airfield in 1942, and a test pilot sitting speechless in a cockpit, trying to understand what he'd just experienced. That's the thing about being ahead of your time. The world doesn't wait for you to catch up. It just moves on, and takes your ideas with it. If you made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Hit subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. We go where the real stories are. And drop a comment. Do you think the Me-262, deployed a year earlier, actually could have changed the outcome of the war? I want to hear your take. I'll see you in the next one.